looking at this, and somebody help me out. Did we talk about, I think we did. I always forget to mark it. It never fails. If I don't mark it, I won't remember. If I do, I'll remember it perfectly. But I think I have down that we were going to talk about, or did talk about, hindrances to my spiritual growth. We talked about things that will hinder growth, personal lusts, false teachers, evil environment. Does that ring a bell? Did we not get to that? Yes. Do what? Oh, yeah. Okay, we did get to that then. So that's, I wanted to mention just a couple things because I remember we were very, very much out of time by the time we got to that. But things that'll hinder our growth. There are a lot of things we could talk about as far as that will keep us from growing spiritually. I think the main one is somebody mentioned they had number 7 on their list, is it's just not important to us. If it is important to us, then we're going to grow. I do remember that because we kind of closed the class talking about, when all is said and done, we do what's important to us. If it's important to someone, a young man, young woman, or crazy about each other, and it's important to them to spend time together, they find a way. There's school, there's work, there's all kinds of things going on. Maybe it's sports. They find a way. If a sport is important to somebody, then they find a way to do it. I've heard of some of my own family members, some of my in-laws. They found out one time, didn't even know about this till later on, but they had a ticket to a ball game. I think it was a football game. Somehow managed to get their hands on tickets. Drove all night, as it was some distance away. Watched the game, and then as soon as it was over, drove all the way back, and then the fella got up and preached the next morning. I don't know, I'd like to have heard that sermon. But I don't know, maybe he had somebody else because he went with a friend, but maybe they drove part of the way. But it just shows when you want to do something, here's an opportunity that doesn't come around all that often. I'm going to go. And that's not, certain situations, it's not wrong. That's just to say we do what we want to do, right? And so if I want to grow as a Christian, then I'll grow. It's not, most of the time I'll say, it's not a matter of I don't know what to do, I don't know how. If that is the case, then that's one of the benefits of a study like this, is we're going to see. But there are a lot of reasons, and we gave several of those last week, and I won't repeat all those. But the main reason why people don't grow spiritually is that they're just not concerned about it. Sometimes we behave, even if we wouldn't come out and say it, we behave as if once I obey the gospel and become a Christian, then that's it. And what more do you want from me? I'll be here when the doors are open, so to speak, but what are you expecting from me? And there's a lot that God expects from us, not as I'm checking this off, earning my way into heaven, but as one who realizes I've been redeemed. And because my Lord has saved me, I think a lot of times we forget where we were. And that's one of the things that Peter, reminds his readers of and us in this epistle is, remember where you were before the Lord saved you. And if that doesn't motivate us to grow, what does? And so let's talk about, in this next little section here, let's talk about the attitude and the effort that is required to grow. Spiritual growth is not going to happen by accident. When it comes to children, they're going to grow. You can't stop it. I suppose the only way to stop it would be just to cut off all, nutrition, period. But they grow. They don't have to think about it. When you're a child, as long as your mom's putting food before you and somebody's setting food on the table and you're eating, you're going to grow. But spiritually, that doesn't happen that way. And even in the sense of, here's an athlete who decides he wants to get stronger, he wants to get faster. Someone who plays an instrument and they want to get better, and maybe they want to excel, go to a state competition or something similar to that, and they decide, I want to take it up a notch. We sometimes use that expression. I want to get better at this. Well, that's not going to happen by accident. Even in the athletic realm, there are those, we've all seen them, probably watched some of them on TV, that, honestly, without even trying, they're better than probably 60, 70, 80% of the other folks out there. It's just unbelievable. Who was the guy several years ago that kind of became famous for his speech on television, and he'd say, practice? We talking about practice? Who was that guy? Yeah, Iverson, yeah, Allen Iverson. I mean, what a waste, right? I mean, how talented was that guy? But here, just lack of effort. In sports and other realms too, I suppose, there are those that they're naturally gifted and they're better than a lot of the other folks, whether they try or not. And some of those folks like that, when they try, it's like, look out, because they're dangerous when they're really putting forth 100% effort. But in the spiritual realm, that's not the case. Success is going to require effort. It's not going to be, you won't talk about somebody and say, boy, that so-and-so, he's just a gifted person with Bible knowledge. I mean, he doesn't even study. He knows more Bible than most of us do. We sometimes act like that, though, don't we? We sometimes act like, so-and-so, he knows his Bible. And I've mentioned it here before, and you've probably heard other preachers mention it too, that the story of a fella coming up to Gus Nichols one time, who was, very, very knowledgeable gospel preacher, and he had preached a sermon somewhere, and someone walked up to him after service and said, boy, I'd just give half my life to know the Bible the way that you do. And he said, that's what it took me. It takes a lot of effort. There's nobody that just, wow, he was just born with some really, really good Bible knowledge. And even in the field of athletics, I think a lot of times we assume someone, I think there are folks definitely who are gifted, but I read something one time from Michael Jordan. And a lot of people just say, oh man, that Jordan, he was just gifted to play basketball. He just had a gift. But Michael Jordan would tell you that gift cost me a lot of time, a lot of effort, a lot of practice. And so I think there was some natural talent there, but at the same time, make no mistake, that man worked his tail off. And I was reading something one time, just the amount of work he put in was incredible. Sometimes we see the result of it on the court, on the rink, on the field, and we say, boy, that guy's really gifted. But a lot of times when we don't see, there's a lot of work going on. And so it is in the spiritual realm. We sometimes may see somebody and just say, boy, look, his knowledge or her knowledge is just amazing. As if it just is, they're born with it. But they're not. It requires a lot of effort, a lot of work. Why do people put out time, money, effort for various things? It's not because they want it. Again, go back to a hobby. If a man likes to fish, if a man likes to play golf, he likes to play some kind of sport, spends money on it, right? I mean, he's give out of his checkbook. He's going to give out of his time. He's going to put forth a lot of effort because that's important to him, right? So I guess we sometimes have to ask ourselves, is it important to me? Let's notice something here in 2 Peter 1. Look at verse 5. What word in there do you think we want to hone in on here in this section? Diligence. Giving all diligence. Add to your faith virtue, and to virtue knowledge. Drop down to verse 10. What's the word there? Wherefore the rather, brethren, give diligence. Now turn over to chapter 3. And look at verse 14. Seeing that you look for such things, we're talking about the new heaven and new earth. Be diligent that you may be found of him in peace, without spot and blameless. You may remember this from last week. Luke 13:24 is the parallel passage to Matthew 7:13 and 14, where Jesus is talking about entering in at the straight gate. Wide is the gate, broad is the way, it leads to destruction. But in Luke 13:24, Jesus says, in the King James at least, it's translated, strive to enter in at the straight gate. Strive. And we've pointed out numerous times that's the Greek word agonizo, and we get our word agonize from that. So it's the idea of putting forth effort. It's not going to be easy. It's not impossible. God has promised, you ask, you shall receive, seek, and you shall find, knock, and it shall be open. But it's not going to be an effortless thing. I've used the illustration many times that there's not one single person on the day of judgment that when God says, well done, good and faithful servant, enter thou into the joy of thy Lord, that they're going to say, me? Really? Are you talking to me? Never would have guessed. Okay, that's not going to happen, folks. We will know because we put forth that diligent effort. In fact, the only surprises on the day of judgment will be those who say, but wait. And really, this is next week's Sunday morning sermon, Matthew 7, 21, 23. Well, wait a minute. But I did this, and they started enumerating all the things, but they weren't following the Lord. Not just calling him Lord, but doing what the will of the Father is. And so Peter says, give diligence. It's we're looking at it here specifically in the book of 2 Peter, but it is a biblical theme throughout. Being diligent. In this I don't know where you all are in your daily Bible reading, those who were doing the read through the Bible, but I'm in Deuteronomy. And I've been reading in Deuteronomy, and that's really what the book is about in large part, is Moses saying, he's reminding the new generation of the law. It's kind of a repeat of the law for that new generation. But he's saying, be diligent. When you get into the land, don't just get lazy and kick your feet up, or kick back, put your feet up and say, here we are, we've arrived. And back to last summer series, one of our lessons was the type-antitype relationship of coming out of Egypt. Sin is a bondage. And so Moses leads the people out of Egypt. Jesus Christ, who's the antitype of Moses, he leads us out of sin, crossing the Red Sea, typical of baptism into Christ. And then we begin that journey to the Promised Land. And sometimes in that journey we're not very diligent, and that's how Israel was a lot of the time. But in Deuteronomy, he reminds those people that even when they get into the Promised Land, which for them was not the true rest, Hebrews 4, there remaineth therefore a rest to the people of God. He says, don't get lazy and just decide we don't have to be diligent. He says, you be diligent to follow the Lord your God in all that you do. Sometimes we just don't do, as the saying goes, due diligence. Yes, sir.
I think we cannot emphasize enough the will of the Father. I think some of us as Christians get hung up on the kind of salvation, and we think we have fulfilled the will of the Father. Truly, just don't think, because they accept the things that happen. If it is a command of the Father, that is the will of the Father. We all have the option to follow the will or not follow the will, depending on our interpretation of the Word. So I think it's very important we examine ourselves when it comes to the will of the Father to see if we are truly doing the will of the Father as a man and as a woman.
Yeah, we have to follow. The Bible uses the analogy of becoming a Christian being adopted into the family of God. Could you imagine, as it's a little bit different for us to imagine this as an adult because we think of an adult being out on your own, but maybe even as a child old enough to be active in the family and do things, not just an infant, in other words. But can you imagine, you adopt, say, a 10, 15-year-old child. They're into your family, you say, you're our family now. And then you say, okay, now in this family we have chores, and so, this one, he takes out the trash, this one takes care of the dishes, this one folds the laundry, this, whatever. And that child says, you come home and say, your chore was to do the dishes. Well, what's going on? The sink's full of dishes, they've not been put in the dishwasher, they've not been washed, whatever. He says, what do you mean? I'm in the family. He said, well, we expect you to take part. You're part of this family. There are things that we do in this family. Oh, no, I'm just in the family. Well, we think that's foolish. But sometimes we do that in the spiritual family. We're adopted into the family of God when we obey the gospel. We become a Christian. Of course, the Bible also uses the analogy of being born into the family of God. Born again, John 3:3-5. But sometimes we just kind of sit there and go, okay, I'm in God's family, but I'm not doing anything in God's family. I'm not active. And again, it's one of the things that we need to emphasize when we study the Christian graces is that I'm not going through this going, okay, I've got faith, virtue, knowledge. This is an ongoing thing. It's not something I can ever just check off and say, done. At the same time, it's not something I can check off and say, okay, what more do you want? We get into a checklist mentality sometimes, and I suppose I'm a bad one about that because I have to watch that because I like checklists. When I am in my office, especially on Monday, I like to make out a list. Here's what I got to get done this week. It gives me great joy to check things off that list. It makes me feel like I accomplished something. Sometimes I will write something that I just did so I can check it off my list and at least get one thing off my list for the day because I never get through the whole list. Sometimes, I'll say, I made that phone call I needed to make, so I'm going to write that down and check it off, But we sometimes get into that mentality with Christianity as if I can just check off enough things and God's going to have two ledgers and he's going to look at what you checked off and here's what's missing over here and he'll go, well, this one is, you got more over here, so well done. Come on in. It's not a scorecard. And there are times when we're going to make mistakes. And there are things that are going to be missing in my life because I'm human. But that's why we get into the book. We study what is the will of the Father, and I'm constantly growing. Is it not safe to say that what we've seen thus far, it is God's will for you and for me to grow? Is that God's will? I don't think there's any question that's God's will. We need to remember that growing spiritually is not equal to perfection. You study, where's Bob when I need him? I got to get some help with a math term here. Y'all can help me, somebody else that's good at math. What is you studied this, I think it was in trigonometry, but there's it'll come down in a loop, or not a loop, but it swings down on your graph, and it'll get closer and closer to the bottom, to 0, I think, 0, 1, I don't know. Anyway, it gets closer and closer and closer. It's not an isotope, is it? It's in the same study as parabolas, but I think it's different from a parabola because they're in a parabola the U shape, or I don't know. Anyway, y'all know what I'm talking about, hopefully, but it'll just constantly get closer and closer. See, I told you I needed Bob. Maybe if Bob is watching this at home, he's recovered from his surgery, he could send me a text message or something. It's gonna just eat me up to know what am I talking about here. But it gets closer and closer and closer. Well, that's the idea, understanding that I'm never going to reach perfection. But as I study God's Word, as I learn more and more what God would have me to do, what He would have me to be, I'm trying every day to grow closer and closer to Him. I'm never going to be 100% sinless because I'm human. And God doesn't say that we have to be. And aren't we grateful for that? But I'm trying every day. It's like the little scrawny fella that had a big appetite. He was just a little boy, and he was just eating, and some grown man was standing there and made a comment about it, and that little fella looked up and he said, well, I'm growing, mister. And he said, growing? He said, you look like you wouldn't be, 60 pounds soaking wet. He says, I don't know about growing. And that little fella looked up at him and he says, well, God ain't done with me yet, mister. So that's how it is spiritually. We're growing. And sometimes you even look at yourself and you say, sometimes even we feel like, and we can get down on ourselves and feel like, I'm not at all where I need to be. And that may even be true. But growing means God ain't done with me yet. And I'm still moving in that direction. So it's going to take effort. It's something I've got to strive to do. In John 6, 26 and 27, Jesus talks about, I think the King James uses the word laboring. Labor not for the meat that perishes, but labor for the true meat. In other words, spiritual things. We'll go to all kind of effort to earn money, right? So we can buy ourselves a nice steak dinner or some kind of food that we like. But how much labor do we put forth to obtain spiritual food, the true food that we need? Paul talks about Philippians 3, 13 and 14, pressing toward the mark for the prize of the high calling of God in Christ Jesus. The idea there is pressing. I'm just pushing. We sometimes say that in sports. You got to really dig down and push. That's what Paul is talking about there. Very quickly, before we go and talk a little bit about faith, let's ask the question, what if I don't grow? Look at verse 8, 2 Peter chapter 1. Looking at verse 8, what happens if I don't grow? Just from this verse. Do what? Barren and unfruitful. That we can take that away from verse 8. Jesus' illustration in John 15, I'm the vine, you're the branches. It's safe to say there that he expects us to bear fruit, right? But if I'm not growing spiritually, I'm unfruitful and I'm barren. Jesus says those are purged and they're cast into the fire. Obviously, that's not something that's going to be pleasant. We don't want that. But that happens if we're not growing. We're barren, we're unfruitful. I'm no master gardener by any stretch, but even a casual observer can tell when there's a section of a vine or a tree or a plant, it's not growing, what happens? You need to prune it. It's cast away because it's barren, it's unfruitful. So that's one consequence. Look at verse 9. What is a consequence? Blind. Can't see afar off. Blindness at the worst, and at best, we would call it nearsightedness. Can't see something, or is it farsighted? I think it's farsighted, right? Anyway, you can't see far off. I'm striking out on my math and science today, but good thing we're in Bible class, right? But you can't see far off. He's forgotten that he's purged from his old sins. And so that's another consequence, spiritual blindness, forgetfulness, forgetting that, forgetting where I once was. And I think that's a key. If I want to grow spiritually, is I have to remember where I was versus where I am. And sometimes, well, it is. It's easy to forget that. Yes, sir.
How impressive is it when you consider the New Testament's teachings right here, that the significance of understanding the Old Testament journey of the children of Israel, that is the physical story of exactly what is being told here, that they stopped being diligent. What happened? They fell away.
Mm-hmm.
Some of them died in the wilderness. The concept of once saved, always saved. These people were saved through the Red Sea. That's what the Bible says.
Right.
And yet fell into the wilderness because of not diligence, or as it says, unbelief.
Yeah, exactly. And, going back to Deuteronomy, one of the key words in Deuteronomy is remember. And when you study that book, may remember it's been obviously several months since we did that as our book of the month, but that was one of the key words that we looked at. It is over and over again, Moses is saying, God through Moses, remember, you were in captivity, you've been delivered. And that's what Peter is saying here. The person who's not growing spiritually, he's forgotten. I mean, he's forgotten where he was versus where he is now and the blessings that he has.
Well, the nearsightedness, they couldn't see it far off. The far off was the promised land. But we're concerned with where are we right this minute? We're thirsty, and we want water right now. Versus saying, God, you cared for us up to this point. We know you're not going to abandon us out here. But they couldn't see it far off. Well, that's exactly what we're warned against right here.
And again, we're talking about growth. It's the idea of a child and their ability to look ahead versus an adult. I mean, children see, especially when a child gets, whether it might be a little bit of an allowance or some money for doing something for someone. Sometimes some of my children now will sometimes try to help out somebody from the church. Maybe they want to go help clean up in a yard or something, and sometimes they'll give them a little bit of money, and it just burns a hole in their pocket. I even told them after Glenn came here, I liked his idea of the dad bank. And so we set up a daddy bank. And I told him I said, tell y'all what, so I'll give you 10% interest for a year. 10% compound interest, that's pretty good, I mean, unfortunately, Levi figured that out. And Levi's made about $20 off Dad so far. but now the other ones, no, man, they can't stand it. You sit here and say, look, you've got $10. If you hang on to that for a month, you'll have 11. And then if you hang on to that for another month, you'll have 12 and 10 cents. And but they can't see afar off. They can't, I even told them at one time, we sat down and figured it up, and don't ask me to go that far in advance with compound interest, but it adds up quick. And I sat down and I said, look, man, at the end of just 10, 11, 12 months, here's what you'd have. It's a lot more. But I need that lightsaber. I need that gun. Okay, I'm gonna let you. Give you some leeway with it. But they don't see it far off, do they? They just see right now what's right in front of them in Walmart. In the toy section. I got to have that. I was there. I mean, I remember being a child. I loved Legos, and man, I could not pass up a little Lego set. I guess they still haven't seen one in a while, but they just have. You could get the big sets, and they cost a lot, and those were like Christmas presents. But then they had the smaller sets, and sometimes if you had a few bucks from your parents or doing a chore or something, you could afford one of those. And I never made it to save up for a big one because I could not see it far off. I got just enough to buy that little teeny tiny set, and that's what I'd buy, and I'd blow it. And if I'd saved, but that's we expect that from children, even new Christians. We expect that to some extent, but growing means you learn to look ahead and even look backwards and remember where you've been. So good thoughts there. But if I don't grow, I'm not doing what God wants. The kingdom entrance is conditional. Let's just be honest about it. The entrance into the kingdom, heaven, we understand, of course, that the kingdom is often used to describe the church, but it's also sometimes used contextually to describe heaven. But the entrance into heaven itself is conditional. An entrance into the church is conditional. But even when I meet the conditions and the Lord adds me to his church, going to heaven is conditional. That's not trying to say that, again, it's not some kind of list of here's what we can do, and just check it off and God's going to be indebted to us. But it is conditional. The extremes there, one extreme says you could just do enough and God's going to owe you salvation. The other extreme says you do nothing and God's still going to give you salvation. God says, here's what I expect of you. One of those things that he expects is growth. We could talk about other things. I want to get into faith just a little bit. We could talk about if I don't grow, Jesus talks about being salt of the earth, light of the world, Matthew 5:13 and 16. How can I be the salt of the earth if I'm not growing spiritually? How can I be light of the world and reflect the true light of the Father if I'm not growing spiritually? What happens to my influence if I'm not growing? The bottom line, again, is if I don't grow, it's because I choose not to, or it's because I'm neglecting that. I've got to give attention to it. And it's not sinlessness, but God does expect me to grow. Anything else on that before we go into, I want to talk about faith as, sometimes we talk about the Christian graces and we forget faith because he says what? Add to your faith. So that's our foundation. Let's get into that and talk about, we've seen God wants us to grow, but when it comes to faith, we've got to understand faith, we've got to demonstrate faith, and we've got to keep on growing in faith. I can't just rest on what I've had in the past. I was talking to a member of the church one time, wasn't faithful, and he was telling me, still friends with him, haven't talked to him in a while, but really, really nice, likable guy. Visited with him so many times and tried to get him to be restored to faithful service. His wife was sporadic in her attendance at best, and a lot of that was due to the husband not being where he needed to be. It was sort of holding her back to some extent. But one day we were talking, well, this happened on several occasions where we'd talk and he'd say, you just don't know. I used to be so active. I used to be so involved. He said, man, he told me one time, he said, I taught Bible class. And, I didn't want to be ugly, but I'm sitting here thinking, well, okay, congratulations, but what's going on now spiritually? You're not doing anything. You're not even attending the services, let alone working for the Lord. There was a man had a wife that was struggling spiritually. He had a child who had been married at that point, was married, and they had 2 children. None of them were faithful. In fact, the child the daughter-in-law and the two grandchildren. Of course, the two grandchildren were babies, basically, but the son and the daughter-in-law were not even Christians. All these people you could be reaching, but you're just stagnant. Not only growing, really, was going backwards. But sit there and say, oh, I remember I used to be so strong. I mean, I was a pillar in the church. Well, okay. I'm not discounting that. Thankful for that. What people have contributed to help the church, whether here or there or wherever. But I can't just rest on that and say, so here I am now and I'm not growing and, put in my time. Sometimes people will say that, won't they? I've heard older members of the church sometimes say that. I'm not going to teach a Bible class. I put in my time. I'm not going to do this. I'm not going to do that. I put in my time. I mean, hey, I'm so many years of age. I put in my time. I'm done. I'm not saying that, everything we do as Christians ought to remain the same from, our 30s on through our 80s or 90s or however old we live to be. Sometimes what we can do and what we can't do changes. But God forbid we ever get the mentality and the mindset that I've just put in my time. Hey, you got a deeper problem if that's your mentality, because that's not biblical, and that's not the mindset God would have us have, is that I've put in my time. What's the song that we sing? We'll work. Somebody finish it. Till Jesus comes, right? I mean, do we mean that when we sing it? Am I going to work till Jesus comes, or am I going to sit until he comes and say, here I am, Lord? Well, we need to be working. There remains, therefore, a rest to the people of God. And so, again, what we do and how we accomplish things for the Lord sometimes changes as we get older, but I don't ever want to have the mindset, well, I've just put in my time. Let somebody else do it. One day, somebody else isn't going to be around. The question is not what kind of faith did I have, but what kind of faith does God want me to have, and what kind of faith do I have right now? And again, all of this study requires a lot of self-examination. And that's hard, isn't it? I mean, let's be honest. It's difficult to look at myself and say, am I really where I need to be? It's easy for me to look at you or somebody else. I mean, we've all been there, right? Maybe even sit there and think, I've done that. I've done this as a preacher. I know I've had numerous people come out at the back doors and tell me, various times when I preach a sermon, somebody come out and say, I wish so bad so-and-so was here to hear that. And sometimes it's true, because maybe somebody was not a Christian and it was a good lesson on becoming a Christian, or maybe it was something that somebody struggled with that they needed to hear, or whatever. I get that. But even as a preacher, I've come out of a sermon before thinking, man, I preached that sermon and old so-and-so wasn't even here today. They needed that. You know what? I needed it. If it's from the Bible, I need it. And you need it. We all need it if it's biblical. And so, as we go through talking about these Christian graces, make sure we're looking inward. Saying, starting here with this faith concept, what's my faith like? Am I where I need to be? Am I growing in faith, or have I kind of become stagnant? So it's not what did I have, it's what about right now? So we want to talk about the Bible's message about faith and my own personal faith. I know we're short on time here. Let's just go to Hebrews 11. Look at this real quick. This will give us a good introduction, and we'll get into the meat of our study of faith next week, Lord willing. Somebody read verse 1, please.
Now faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen.
Okay, so, faith is a foundational thing. Drop down to verse 6. Read that, please.
But without faith it is impossible to please him. For he that cometh to God must believe that he is, and that he is a rewarder of them that diligently seek him.
All right, faith is necessary for our initial salvation, right? Now, what happens a lot of times, sadly, in the religious world, this gets mixed up. And people will teach, just believe and you'll be saved. That's not the biblical teaching. At the same time, we got to understand that you do have to have faith. We don't want to de-emphasize it either. So it is absolutely necessary for initial salvation. In fact, John chapter 3. We'll turn over to John 3:16 is a passage that everybody knows. But let's read 16 to 18. Who's got that? Gary, you got it? Go ahead.
For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. For God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but that the world through him might be saved. He who believes in him is not condemned, but he who does not believe is condemned already, because he has not believed in the name of the only begotten Son of God.
Okay, so people say, well, man, the Bible says right there, believe and you'll be saved. But we also understand Luke 6:46, Jesus says, why do you call me Lord, Lord, and do not the things which I say do? We've already talked about Matthew 7:21. Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, shall enter into the kingdom of heaven, but he that doeth the will of my Father which is in heaven. So faith is necessary for our initial salvation. It's believing in Jesus. And if I really believe, can I say I really believe that he is the Christ if I'm not going to be willing to do what he says do? No. Now, again, that's not to say that I won't make mistakes, but a mistake is different. If someone forgets to do something that they're supposed to do, maybe you're at work and the boss tells you to do something and you honestly forget. Well, is it still wrong? Is something that, you're held accountable for? Yes. But that's a big difference than if the boss says do something and you say, yeah, I heard what you said. I remembered it. I didn't want to do it. I chose not to. Big difference, right? We understand that. Same thing, family, with our children. If they forget to do something, if they make a mistake, they do something careless like kids tend to do, or if they just say, you heard me, you understood what I said, you just didn't want to do it. You didn't want to stop playing your video game. You didn't want to stop watching your show. You didn't want to stop doing this, whatever. You just chose not to do it. Big difference. So faith leads us to follow what God would have us to do. Mark 16:16, he that believeth and is baptized shall be saved. So faith is necessary for initial salvation, but it's also necessary, go back to Hebrews chapter 10, it's also necessary for our continued salvation. Again, it's not about what my faith was like in the past. It's not just, when I obeyed the gospel, I had faith like, this big. Well, what about now? Well, it was big. It's not about the past. It's necessary for continual salvation as well, to stay saved, we sometimes say. Hebrews 10, look at 38 and 39. It's quoting from Habakkuk. The just shall live by what? Faith. But if any man draw back, my soul shall have no pleasure in him. We're not of them that draw back unto perdition, but of them that believe to the saving of the soul. So it's necessary to continue to stay saved. 2 Corinthians 5:7 says what? We walk by faith, not by sight. So it's part of becoming a Christian, but it's also part of staying a Christian. Look at Hebrews 10 while you're there, 22 and 23. Let us draw near with a true heart in full assurance of faith, having our hearts sprinkled from an evil conscience and our bodies washed with pure water. Let us hold fast the profession of our faith without wavering, for he is faithful that promised. And so faith is something that you have to have. It's involved in the process of becoming a Christian. But make no mistake, folks, it is involved in the process of staying a disciple of Jesus Christ. And we're going to talk more about that, Lord willing, next week. We'll have a break before worship. Thank you very much for your time and attention.